I want to welcome you to the Dallas Independent School District STEM Environmental Education Center virtual field trip. Teachers, if you're watching and you have not signed up, please do so. Go to www.tiny.cc/high-school-restoration and fill out the form, please. This program is called Managing Resources. During this virtual field trip, students will explore methods of land use and management and describe its effects on land fertility. Students will also identify source, use, quality, management, and conservation of water. Ms. Schramm will present crop rotation. Mr. Dominguez will do composting. Ms. Ramirez, sources and uses of water, and Mr. Monroe, management and conservation of water. And during this program, you cannot verbally ask us a question, but you can go to www.tiny.cc/question-answer and fill out a question, and we will do our best to answer it. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Ms. Schramm is going to tell you all you ever wanted to know about crop rotation.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ms. Schramm, and I'm from the Environmental Center. And today I'm going to talk to you about crop rotation. So let me get this up and going. All right, so at the end of my little video, you'll be able to understand and describe the basics of crop rotation. So first of all, let's talk about the reasons for crop rotation. So farmers noticed these problems when they were doing traditional farming, which would be just one field with the same crop year after year after year. So the problems they encountered were pests and diseases. Here are some different examples of typical garden pests, but different types of plants are more susceptible to having the same pests year after year. And so a lot of times farmers that were just planting one crop per field were encountering horrible crops that were destroyed by certain pests year after year after year. So crop rotation definitely helps with that. Also to avoid nutrient deficiency. This is a picture of corn that has, I believe, a potassium deficiency. And if you keep growing corn in the same soil every year, the nutrients that the corn takes will be completely depleted. They'll be gone. So different crops take different nutrients. And so it's important to rotate those crops so that your nutrients have a chance to bounce back before that crop comes back again. And then also weed growth. Crop rotation helps with weed growth. Different plants are more likely to be overcome by weeds. So say if it's a lower growing plant and it takes longer to develop and get bigger, a lot of times it can get shadowed out by weeds. Whereas if it's a taller plant or faster growing, it can kind of snuff out those weeds and get to the sun first. All right, then my most important reason for crop rotation is it reduces the need for artificial pesticides and weed killers. This is huge. I mean, if you want to go green and do organic farming, it is so important to avoid those nasty pesticides that can make us sick and really negatively impact the environment. So here's a crop rotation on a large scale. So this is like at a farm level, and they have corn rotating with soybeans. So the corn, say, would be in one half of the farmer's field, the soybeans maybe the other, and they swap year after year. Different plants need to be in the same field for different lengths of time. So this is just a simple example because corn is an annual plant, which means it grows and goes through its life cycle in 1 year. And then, so it grows for a year and it's done. So you either replant it or plant something else. Different crops need to be in a field longer because they are perennials. So that means their life cycle takes multiple years or they come back every year. And whoops, here we go. So on a smaller scale, it's a little more, it can get a little more complicated, but also is what I'm more familiar with because I do not only farm. I live here where I'm at in Oak Cliff, and I grow a bit of vegetables and smaller scale crops at the environmental center. So this is kind of a simple example of crop rotation for a home gardener. So say in one garden bed, you have potatoes or tomatoes. Another, you have legumes. So the beans, peas, all those sorts. Brassicas, which are like more the shorter ones, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, cabbage. Those are kind of the shorter leafy ones. And then you have your root vegetables. So those are like carrots, beets, celery, and all those other root crops. And what you would do is just rotate year after year. One year you plant the potatoes, then you go legumes, brassicas, and then roots. Pretty simple. And this is a similar way. This is probably more similar to what I am familiar with using. You have legumes, root vegetables, fruit vegetables, and leafy vegetables. So you see she's got her garden beds planned out, just 4 basic garden beds. And what she plants year after year just rotates what she puts in each bed. This is our little garden by the barn here at the EEC. And there are some alternatives to crop rotation if it gets too complicated. There are really, I've showed you simple systems, but there are really complex systems that span year after year after year that get a little more complicated. But there are some alternatives, especially on a smaller scale, that are manageable. So you can amend the soil by adding compost, which you'll learn about composting in a little bit. You can protect the soil by mulching it over when it's not being used. Low or no dig methods. So a lot of times when you over dig or you over till, a lot of those important microbes or worms or any other positive things that are growing in the soil, they get exposed and it kind of messes up the balance in the soil. And also that unbalance invites like an opportunity for pests to come in and really take over. So low or no dig methods, you just kind of, like I said, you add the compost, you don't tear up the entire garden bed to start fresh. And then this is probably my favorite. This is something I'm trying for the first time right here in the garden beds, is succession planting. So succession planting is almost like crop rotation in that you are using the same garden bed, but you are planting different things throughout the year. So in traditional crop rotation, you think of it as you have potatoes in this bed for the entire year. And once the potato crop is done, the garden bed is done, you wait till next year to plant something else. Succession planting is different. Like you can see in the left, I have those crazy tomato plants that are at their end. So with succession planting, what I've done, which I don't have featured, but you take out the tomato plants and you amend the soil and then you plant something else. So because the tomato plants are more of a summer crop, I can take those out, amend the soil, and then place my winter crops in the soil. And then it's like crop rotation because it goes from the winter leafy greens and then back to tomatoes. So there are other ways to treat crop rotation, especially in a smaller scale. But definitely crop rotation in large fields, it's a lot more difficult and more it's more costly to, amend an entire field. So crop rotation is a great organic way of managing those larger farms. So I hope you learned something about crop rotation, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.
Now, a student wants a good, brief definition and example of crop rotation. Crop rotation is the practice of planting different crops sequentially on the same plot of land to improve soil health, optimize nutrients in the soil, and combat pest and weed pressure. When the corn is harvested, and the farmer next would plant beans, because corn consumes a lot of nitrogen from the soil and beans return nitrogen to the soil. Now, Mr. Dominguez is going to tell you all about composting.
Hey guys, it's Mr. Dominguez here at the garden section of our wonderful EEC. And this is where we grow a variety of different crops: tomatoes, cucumbers, collard greens, okra, all kinds of wonderful stuff that we use not only to feed ourselves, but our animals. And today I'm going to be talking to you about a component that is very important to soil health, especially if you are thinking of starting your own garden at home. It is compost. And compost is a wonderful way to not only reduce food waste, but increase the nutrients needed for your plants to thrive. And I'm going to be talking to you about two types of compost: your more traditional compost and vermicompost. And I will help you set up your own vermicompost bin, which I think is a really fun project to do at home or maybe even the classroom. So we're going to head back inside and we're going to get started. I will give you guys a materials list and help you through every step of your vermicompost bin. Let's get started, guys. All right, so compost is the decayed organic material used as plant fertilizer, but today we are going to focus on a special type of compost called vermicompost. And vermicompost is the product of the decomposition process using various species of worms, usually red wigglers, white worms, and other earthworms. This time around, we'll be using red wigglers. Those are my favorite. And their product is vermicast. And vermicast are the worm's poop. And that poop is actually an incredibly wonderful fertilizer filled with nitrogen. And nitrogen is what plants need to grow and to thrive and to produce tons of food for you guys. All right, guys, so let's get started with our vermicompost bin, but let's recap what vermicompost is and what the purpose and what the end result of your composting is. So vermicompost is a type of compost that is produced by worms, and there's a different variety of worms that you can use, but for my purposes, and I think this is a good starter worm, we're going to use red wigglers. You can't really see them here, but they're in there. They're in there hiding. So we're going to use some red wigglers, and what they're going to do for us is they're going to take care of all the waste products. But there is a little asterisk that I need to make you guys aware of. They can't take care of all your food waste products. So nothing like dairy, nothing like meat, none of that is good for worms. You want to stick with leafy greens, anything that is green in your kitchen, fruits, banana peels, cabbage, lettuce. Things like that are okay for the worms to eat. Now, after they eat and they digest, what do worms do? They're going to poop. And that poop, we call them worm castings, are an incredible source of nitrogen. And that nitrogen is incredibly important for protein development within a plant, and in fact within any animal. So you need nitrogen in order for your DNA and your RNA to properly make proteins for cell growth and all kinds of other metabolic functions. But for plants, earth castings are wonderful, and they will help any garden, especially those that produce food, be more bountiful. So I've had firsthand experience with that. So all you're going to need for your vermicompost bin is, of course, a bin. So, and if you're just starting off, I recommend something in the 12-gallon to 15-gallon range. And then you can move up once you start realizing, hey, I'm gonna need more worm castings for my expanding garden. You are going to need a drill, and the drill is simply used for ventilation holes, which I have already drilled into my container, right? So we need those worms to be able to breathe. And it's mostly because you don't want an anaerobic bacterial environment. You don't want bacteria, especially bad bacteria, to take over your bin. So you need ventilation, okay? You are going to need some sort of bedding for your worms to live in. So the bedding will be made up of two things, and there are different options, but what I like to use is coconut coir, okay, and it comes dehydrated in bricks. When you add water to this, it will expand. So this should be enough for our needs today. You just need to add water to this, and we'll do that in a little bit. You're gonna need some sort of newspaper bedding. Since I'm a teacher, I have plenty of copy paper that, you know, sometimes I don't use, or papers that, you know, just that we get, and I don't want it to go to waste. So instead of, you can either recycle it or use it for your vermicompost bin, or you can even add it to your compost pile if you wanted to do traditional composting. But since we're doing vermicomposting, this will be perfect for the worms. And the worms actually do eat the newspaper or the copy paper or whatever it is that you chose to use, and they also eat the coconut coir. So they're wonderful creatures. They're decomposers, so you would expect that from our little worms. Now, you will need to order some worms, so this is probably the most expensive part of the entire project. Is getting some red wigglers. So the red wigglers you can order online. I do not recommend getting worms or digging up worms from your backyard or from your school because they're part of that environment. Whenever you take something, an organism from an environment, you are taking away a part of a food chain. You are preventing other animals from eating that animal. So you break a chain that is necessary for the environment to properly function. So we don't want that. We don't want to ever take wild animals, or no matter how small or large they are, from the environment. So order your worms online. I would say start off with a pound, okay? So first things first, all I'm gonna do is I'm going to add my paper to the bin. Like I said, I've already pre-drilled the hole, so we don't need to do that. We've already kind of skipped that step. So it's a pretty easy setup that we have here. Now, I will mention one more thing. If you ever look up how to do this online, a lot of people will tell you that you're going to need some sort of drainage hole at the bottom. But if you maintain proper levels of greens in here, and proper levels of browns, and browns are things like newspaper, cardboard, and things like that, you're going to need a 50-50 balance of those two things. If you keep it balanced and you don't have too much moisture coming from your greens, or your banana peels, your cabbages, if you have a good balance of your paper source and your greens, so your browns and your greens, you won't have a problem where you start getting a buildup of liquid here at the bottom, which is something that you don't want, because even though worms need a moist environment to properly breathe, because they breathe through their skin, you don't want that, because you're going to start getting anaerobic conditions where bad bacteria grow. So you don't want that. Okay, so I will fast forward a little bit. Because dehydrating this, I'm sorry, not dehydrating, but hydrating this does take a little bit. So I am going to be back with this hydrated so you can see what it looks like after you add water to it. And then finally we'll add our worms, and then we'll give them their first meal, which will be some kale that I had left over. All right, so let's get started. We'll fast forward this process, and then we'll show you the end result and what your bin should look like. All right, guys, we're all done. I know it looks a bit messy, but your worms are gonna enjoy their hydrated bedding with the scraps of paper. In a little bit, I'll go get some greens for them to munch on. Those are the leftover greens that would have just gone in the trash otherwise. So the whole point of vermicomposting, like I said, is to use these little creatures, our worms, to decompose the food waste that we would have normally just thrown in the trash. So this is a great way to help out the environment and to supplement your gardens. In about a month or two, you should be able to see the soil darken. That will be the worm castings ready to go. And like I said, if you're successful, if you like this, I welcome you to expand. They will start breeding. Your worms will start breeding, and you're going to eventually start getting some more worms. And when that happens, you can definitely go a size up in bins. So guys, I hope that you guys learned a little something about vermicomposting, and I hope you guys use this to recycle your food waste and to grow your own food with those worm castings. I'll see you guys next time for the next virtual field trip.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dominguez. And we did have a question or a request, a brief definition of composting. Composting is a natural process of recycling organic matter, such as leaves and food scraps, into a valuable fertilizer that can enrich the soil. And now Ms. Ramirez is going to tell us all about sources and uses of water.
Hello, my name is Ms. Ramirez, and in this segment, we're going to be learning about water sources and uses. So why exactly is this important? If we take a look at our globe over here, we can see that over 71% of Earth's surface is actually covered in water. And the majority of that is all ocean or salt water. So what we're going to do is just a quick little demonstration just to see where our water is coming from. So what I have here is a big graduated cylinder. It's 1,000 milliliters. And we're going to say that this 1,000 milliliters represents all of the water on planet Earth. Now, I'm going to have you guys guess, of this 1,000 milliliters, how many milliliters do you think would represent the total amount of fresh water on Earth? So if this 1,000 milliliters is the total amount of water on Earth, how many milliliters do you think would represent the amount of fresh water? So go ahead and make your guess. And while you guys are making your guess, I'm going to show you some other little representations. So if 1,000 milliliters represents all the water on Earth, of that 1,000 milliliters, 972 milliliters represent salt water. So we know that the majority of water that's found here on Earth is indeed salt water that's not readily usable for us. And we know, unfortunately, a small percentage, only 2.5% to 3% of the total water on Earth is actually usable in the form of fresh water. So of that big 1,000 milliliters, only 28 milliliters represents fresh water. So that's a small proportion. Now let's take it even further.
So of this 28 milliliters that represents the fresh water, how much of that do you think is actually usable as surface water? So just take a guess how many milliliters you think that is. So if this 28 milliliters represents fresh water, let's break down what fresh water is comprised of. So of that 28, 23 milliliters is in ice caps and glaciers. Now we can't obviously readily use that water because it's frozen. So a large portion of that fresh water, again, is not usable. We have another 4 milliliters that is groundwater, so that's in aquifers and in the ground. And then we have just a small portion of that fresh water, about 1 or 2 drops is going to be the amount of fresh water that is readily usable for us today. So that's why our water is so important, and that's why it's important for us to conserve, because if you remember, we started out with that 1,000 milliliters. Of that 1,000 milliliters, only this one tiny drop is what's readily available for us to use. So that's why we're learning about water today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll look at a super quick presentation. So let me get that screen share started. And I do have a couple of little questions for you guys. This little infographic here is just a recap of what we went over. So you can see most of our water is going to be salt water, and it's going to be found in the oceans. A very small percentage of that, about 2.5 to 3%, is fresh water. And again, of that fresh water, a super small percent is actually what's usable for us today. So hopefully by the end of our presentation, you'll be able to answer these questions. The first is, what are the sources of water available in different ecosystems? And then 2 is, how is water used in the local community? So here's a quick little video of some water sources around the EEC. So think about some water sources around you guys. We're here in Seagoville, and we actually have quite a few ponds and lakes. There's quite a few farm and pasture. There's a livestock around us. So a lot of the people around here are using that to water their cattle, their chickens, their animals. There's a nursery, a plant nursery right next to us. So they're using a lot of water to water their gardens and their plants. There's some homes and businesses around us. So they're using water for residential uses. Here's our EEC pond. It's an ephemeral pond, meaning sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not. It kind of depends on the time of the year and the drought. But our ponds are important habitats for fish, frogs. Those are some spoonbills eating some fish, but we often see egrets, herons, and other water birds. Here's a little man-made pond that was made. It was meant for the ducks, but we had a random pig show up one day. Here's a puddle in the parking lot. So after we had heavy rain, sometimes that rainwater will puddle and form that little puddle that you see there. Again, we have livestock out here, so we use a lot of water to water those animals. And then there's a lake across the street from us, and that's what you guys were seeing there. That lake is very common for fishing and other recreation uses. So on our next slide, these are just some common examples of water sources. So we have a wetland. There's actually the John Bunker Sands wetland, which is down the road from us, further down in Seagoville. So I highly recommend you guys visit it. A wetland is just an area of land that's saturated with water permanently or seasonally. And they're important because they serve as a filter. So they help to filter pollution and other bad things from the water. Here we have a river. So the closest river to us over here in Seagoville would be the Trinity River. And a river is just a large natural stream that's usually flowing either toward an ocean, a sea, a lake, or another stream. Here we have a lake. So the closest lake to where I used to live would be White Rock. And so a lake is just a large body of water that's surrounded by land. And oftentimes we use those lakes for recreation, like boating and fishing. Here's a beautiful aquifer. The closest aquifer to us is the Edwards Trinity Aquifer. And it's just a body of permeable rock that holds groundwater. And I was just so amazed at how clear and beautiful that water is. There's also springs. So we have Barton Springs in Austin, and a spring is just a point at which water flows from an aquifer and it's reaching the Earth's surface. So they also have pretty clear water. The ocean, so we have the Gulf of Mexico, and an ocean is just a large body of salt water. We also have these very unique marshes, And a marsh is just a low-lying land, which is flooded in the wet seasons or during high tides. And they're often like a transition zone between terrestrial and aquatic life. And then we also have bays and estuaries, which are probably not near us, but once you go further down toward the Gulf, you'll see those bays and estuaries. They're just a body of water partially enclosed by land that is either directly opened or connected to the ocean. So those are just some examples of water sources. Now, when we talk about water use, it's important to figure out, well, where exactly does Dallas water come from? And there's actually quite a few sources. So Dallas County currently obtains water from 5 area reservoirs. And you can see those, they are denoted in the dark blue over here on the map. So there's Lake Ray Roberts, Louisville, Grapevine, Lake Ray Hubbard. So we use a lot of those, and that's where we get our water from. There are plans to use Lake Fork and Lake Palestine in the future if our water demands increase. And something interesting is all of Dallas water supply comes from surface water, from those reservoirs and rivers. So we don't actually use any groundwater, even though we actually sit on top of an aquifer. And then something I learned that I found interesting, these pipelines that they use to move and transport water, they are really large. You can actually fit a huge Dodge truck, can actually fit right through those pipelines. And there was actually a pipeline, I live near Cedar Creek Reservoir over here, and they were actually in the process when I first moved there of creating a pipeline to connect it to the Dallas water sources. So I know a lot of people at the time were not very happy because they were digging up people's land to dig those pipelines. But that's important because we need water after all. And then let's talk about some water usage. So there's 2 types of water use. There's the direct water use, and then there's also virtual water use. So virtual water use is the indirect use of water. So water is used in the making of the food that you guys eat, the things that we buy, and the energy that we use. So when we talk about virtual use, kind of think about the things that you are using and what you're wearing and how water was used to make those things. So let's do a quick little guessing game. So we're going to see how many gallons of water do you think it takes to, the first one, so how many gallons do you think it takes to grow 1 leaf of lettuce? So go ahead and make your guess for that one. The second one is make your guess, how many gallons of water do you think it takes to grow and produce ingredients for 2 slices of bread? And then the next one, make your guess, how many gallons of water do you think it takes to produce 1/5 a pound of turkey? So that's usually about the amount of turkey you would put in a turkey sandwich. So go ahead and make your guesses, how many gallons you think it takes for each of those water-wise, and I'm going to show you guys the answer. And it's kind of surprising. So we don't often think of how water is used for these everyday items, but for 1 leaf of lettuce that you might put in your sandwich, it actually takes about 2 gallons of water. So if you're thinking about the time that that seed is planted to the time it takes to harvest that lettuce, you're going through about 2 gallons of water to help that lettuce grow. If we take a look at the 2 slices of bread, it takes about 24 gallons of water. So that's from the time that that wheat is able to be planted and watered and grown to the point of manufacturing. We also have some other examples with the 2 slices of cheese is 32 gallons of water. So think about the water that's used to feed those animals and the water used for the production of that cheese. And then also for the 1/5 pound of turkey, 104 gallons of water. So think about the water that's needed to help the actual turkey survive so that the animal doesn't get dehydrated, but also the water needed for the manufacturing part of that meat as well. So a lot of water goes into our everyday things. And then something that you guys can do, you can go to the watercalculator.org website, and you can actually use their calculator to determine how much water you're using both directly and indirectly. So I highly recommend you visit the watercalculator.org website that you see on the slide. I went ahead and put in my input, and it said that I used about 2,299 gallons a day. Now, take into consideration that this number is both the direct and my indirect water usage. So for my direct water usage, for my shower, I take long showers. So I use a lot of water, I know, with the showers, the laundry, the sink, and all that kind of stuff. So 220 gallons for my direct water usage. But when you talk about my indirect water usage, the water that's being used to produce like the clothes and the foods that I'm eating, that's a lot. I love to go shopping and I eat a lot of processed foods, unfortunately. I also have many pets, so they go through a lot of water as well. So my indirect water usage is super high, probably compared to you guys. But definitely go to that water calculator and see how much water you guys are using. Now, it is interesting to compare your water use to the state water usage. So this is for Texas water usage. Take a moment to examine the chart and make any inferences. So what are you guys noticing as far as how Texas is using its water in general? And something I noticed is that this green line is for irrigation, and it's predicted that over the next few decades, that amount of water being used for irrigation and crops is going to decline, while the amount of water being used for municipal purposes like cities and residential is actually going to increase. So that's interesting because we're starting to increase our city life, but the kind of rural area looks like it might be declining as far as their usage for crops. So it is interesting to see how those two numbers are changing over time. But also think about compare Texas to another state, like maybe New York or one of the more urban states, and compare their water usage to ours. Here is water usage by sector for the entire United States. So again, take a moment if you want to pause the video and make some inferences about some things that you guys are noticing. But right away, I can see that US is using most of its water for thermoelectric power, so as an electric power source. And then the next one is for irrigation, so things like farming and crops. And then about 12% for the power supply. So how do you think water usage by sector in the US compares to water usage in other countries by sector? So some other countries that rely heavily on crops for food, their irrigation will probably be a lot higher, be higher usage compared to us in the US. And then here's water use around the world, which I also found super interesting. So why do you think individuals in the US seem to use more water compared to other countries? So the average person in the US, this one is going based on direct usage, not virtual usage. So for direct usage, the average person in the US is about 156 gallons a day. Compare it to someone in France who's only about 77 gallons a day, or over here in Mali, the person's who's only using on average 3 gallons a day. So why do you think there's such a huge difference in the way Americans might use water compared to others around the globe? And that's all I have for you guys. I'm going to stop my screen share and we are going to give it back to Dr. Borman to answer any questions. Y'all have a great week.
Thank you so much, Mr. Maris. And a question did come in. What are the two main sources of water available to us? There are two main sources of water, surface water and fresh water, and groundwater. Surface water is found in lakes, rivers, and reservoirs. Groundwater lies underneath the surface of the land where it travels through and fills openings in the rocks. The rocks that store and transmit groundwater are called aquifers. And we have a small example of that here in the Environmental Center. We have a windmill where the water travels underground through the sand and is pumped up by wind, and we use it to water our cattle and also to help fill up our small pond. Thank you again, Ms. Ramirez, for an interesting program. And let's have Mr. Monroe tell us about management and conservation of water.
Good morning, students. My name is Mr. Monroe, and I'm briefly going to cover management and conservation of water. So why is that so important? Now, you've heard a lot about the water content of our planet. Would it interest you to know that we have no new water in our world today? The water that we're using in our everyday lives today is the same water that was here during the dinosaur times. And yet our world population of people is constantly growing. So there's an important reason why we should be conserving water. I've got a very short presentation that I want to show you, and then I'm going to come back and talk about the programs that the city of Dallas have going so that we don't run into the situation where there's not enough water. So bear with me right quick. one drop at a time. Well, water is very important, students. One drop at a time. And we take a lot of things for granted. And that is one thing that I know we take for granted. When a drop of two of water hits or is wasted, we don't think anything about it. Your everyday routine causes us to use a lot of water. We need to be trying to conserve water by, first of all, on a personal level, or family level, install water-saving devices. Take shorter showers. Now, you heard Ms. Ramirez admit she takes long showers, so she might want to modify that. Turn off the water while you're brushing your teeth. And I used to do that, brushing my teeth. I let that faucet constantly run. Now, we've seen this happen with the new types of toilet stools that have come out. They don't use as much water, but I do know that there are a lot of times we have plumbing leaks that we need to repair. We've replaced, a lot of people are replacing the older tanks that used a lot of water. At one time, it was very economical or efficient to use a toilet stool that flushed or used about 3 gallons of water to actually flush. But today, there are new toilets with a flushing power of 1.5. That's the way to go. Don't leave faucets running. Run dishwashers and clothes washers only when they are full. I used to have a bad habit of just washing a few of the favorite things that I love to wear, and that was not good. The most wasteful water habit we have in cities is watering our lawns. Here are some more tips. If you're going to water your lawn, water them early in the morning. Water infrequently and deeply. Use drip irrigation or soaker hoses. Collect rainwater to use on gardens. Landscape with native plants. And we do know that there are native plants that don't necessarily require a lot of water. Switch to electric or push mowers. Leave grass clippings in place. Don't waste tap water through evaporation. Don't water on windy days. Don't water using a fine mist sprinkler. Don't water when water is in short supply. Don't water during the heat of the day. Use motor oil from a single oil, used motor oil from a single oil change can contaminate millions of gallons of water, enough to supply 50 people for water for 1 year. Use biodegradable products for house and lawn care. Never dispose of cleaners or pesticides in a toilet, sink, or storm drain. Now, I'm going to stop because I'm running out of time right here. I do want to share this with you. Ms. Ramirez went over the sources of water that the city of Dallas has. A lot of people don't believe that Dallas has an outstanding water system or utility system as far as water is contained. But the city of Dallas has received a variety of awards from the EPA, and they use recycling wastewater as a way to conserve water. The city of Dallas has 2 pumping stations that actually will recycle what we call wastewater. They go through a process of using chemical treatment, settling, filtering, disinfecting, and purifying this water to where it can be used as drinking water once again. Most of the time, in fact, I will say most likely, the water, if you're drinking the city of Dallas's water, it is the best water in at least 5 states: the state of Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and New Mexico. The pumping stations that are processing the wastewater simply processes that wastewater, releases it back into the Trinity River where it goes downstream, and it is reused by other cities. And you may be surprised to know that the treated wastewater that is returned to the river is much cleaner than the water when it was taken in. Stringent EPA standards are constantly met by the city of Dallas. Now, that's about all the time I've got with you. So guys, have a good rest of the day. And I bet Dr. Gorman can answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Monroe. And the question came in at the Environmental Center. Do we have any water conservation programs? Yes, we do. We have a 2,500 gallon rainwater collecting system at the barn. The rain falls on the barn, runs through gutters into this big 2,500 gallon tank, and that water is used to water all the barn animals out here. We don't use any energy to pump water up here or city water, and that is our main water conservation program. And now I'm going to share my screen. During this virtual field trip, students explored methods of land use and management and described its effects on land fertility. Students also identified source, use, quality, management, and conservation of water. Ms. Schramm presented crop rotation, Mr. Dominguez composting, Ms. Ramirez told you all about sources and uses of water, and Mr. Monroe did a program called Management and Conservation of Water. Thank you so much for your participation. If you would, go to www.tiny.cc/hsfeedback. Send us in a short form. Tell us how we did. Thank you again for joining us.